My name in this story is Elias. Though for most of my life, it felt like I didn't have a name at all. Just a role. The reliable one. The invisible one. The one who cleaned up everyone else's messes and presented the bill to nobody. I was 26 when my family traded me away to save my brother. And what happened next was something none of them saw coming. Elias stood in the doorway of his parents' living room and felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had come home because his mother's voice on the phone had been trembling. He had thought someone was sick. He had thought there had been an accident. He had rushed across town with his coat half-buttoned, his heart in his throat, ready to help the way he always helped. Instead, he found his father sitting stiffly on the sofa, his mother wringing a dish towel by the window, and his younger brother Leo curled in the armchair with mascara running down his cheeks. And standing near the fireplace, out of place in that shabby little room, was a man Elias had never seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than everything in this house combined. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his eyes, God, his eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and steady and utterly unreadable. But it wasn't his size or his suit that made Elias's breath catch. It was the scent. Even from across the room, even through the haze of his family's anxiety and his brother's distress, Elias caught it. Cedar and smoke and something deeper, something that made the back of his neck prickle with recognition. Alpha. Not just any alpha. An alpha whose presence seemed to fill the room like a physical force, pressing against Elias's senses in a way that felt both threatening and impossibly safe. Elias felt his own scent shift involuntarily, a faint bloom of something that betrayed him. He was unmated, unclaimed. His body recognized what his mind was still trying to process, and his instincts whispered warnings and promises in equal measure. "What's going on?" Elias asked. No one answered right away. That silence told him more than any words could have. His father cleared his throat. "Elias, sit down. There's something we need to discuss." Elias didn't sit down. The man by the fireplace turned to look at him then, and Elias felt something shift in his chest. A pull. A recognition he didn't understand and didn't want to acknowledge. Omega, he thought he saw the alpha's nostrils flare almost imperceptibly. Unmated. And Elias looked away quickly. His mother made a small broken sound. It was Leo who finally spoke, his voice thick with tears. "His name is Dante Marchetti," Leo whispered. "And it's my fault, Eli. It's all my fault." Piece by piece, the story came out. And with every piece, Elias felt something inside him go colder. Leo, 23 and reckless and always forgiven, had gotten himself into trouble. Real trouble. He'd borrowed money, a great deal of money, from people who did not forgive missed payments. He'd borrowed it to keep his failing art gallery open, and then to cover the first loan, and then to cover the second, until the debt had grown into something monstrous, something with teeth. And the man those debts eventually belonged to was Dante Marchetti, the man who owned half the waterfront and most of the shadows behind it. The man whose name people said quietly, if they said it at all. They were going to take everything, his father said, and he could not meet Elias's eyes. The house. Everything. And they said, Marchetti's people said, that a debt like this doesn't just go away with money, that there had to be a guarantee. A person. Elias stared at him. A person, he repeated. Someone to work off the balance, his mother whispered. In his household, under his roof, until the debt is settled. The room was very quiet, and then Elias understood all at once why his brother was crying, and why his father could not look at him, and why they had called him and not Leo home tonight. "You're giving them Leo," Elias said. It wasn't a question. It was a hope. His father's silence was an answer, and it was the wrong one. No, his mother said gently, the way you might explain something to a child. Leo has his whole life ahead of him, sweetheart. He has the gallery. He's fragile. You know how he is. He wouldn't survive it. He's an Omega, Elias thought bitterly. And so am I. But you. His mother reached out and touched his arm, and Elias flinched. You're so strong, Eli. You always have been. You can handle anything. You always land on your feet. There it was. The sentence that had defined his entire life. You're so strong. You can handle it. The sentence they used every time they needed to take something from him and did not want to feel guilty about it. 26 years. 26 years of being the one who gave up his college funds so Leo could have his. The one who moved back home to care for their grandmother while Leo traveled. The one who worked 2 jobs and asked for nothing and got nothing. And now they were handing him to a stranger. Like a chair being carried out to the curb. You're all serious, he said. His voice did not shake, and he was proud of that. You're actually serious. Elias, his father began. But Elias was already looking at the man by the fireplace. Dante Marchetti, who had watched this entire scene without saying a single word. And he saw something flicker across the alpha's face, something he wouldn't understand until much later. It was not triumph. It was not hunger. It was something almost like shame. So, Elias said to him, lifting his chin, this is how it works. My family owes you money, so you take a person instead. Dante studied him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in Elias's chest. That is how they explained it to you. Yes. And what do you say? Something shifted in those gray eyes. I say, he answered slowly, that I did not ask for a person. I said the debt would need a guarantee. Your family chose what that guarantee would be. He glanced briefly at Elias's father, and there was contempt in it. I did not choose you, Elias. They did. The distinction landed like a slap. But not on Elias. On them. His father's face went red. His mother looked away. And Elias, standing in the ruins of every illusion he had ever held about the people who were supposed to love him, made a decision that surprised even himself. Fine, he said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into a well. Eli, you don't get to say no, Elias said to his brother, and Leo fell silent. You don't get to cry and say sorry, and then let me pay for it. Not anymore. He turned back to Dante. How long? Dante considered him. The balance would take approximately 2 years to settle. At a fair wage. 2 years. Elias nodded as if they were discussing a lease. Inside, he was screaming. Outside, he was made of stone. Then let's go. He did not hug his mother. He did not look back at his father. He walked out into the cold night with a stranger, carrying nothing but his coat and the shattered pieces of everything he had once believed about family. The car was long and black and silent. A driver held the door. Elias slid into the leather seat and pressed his hands flat against his knees so they wouldn't shake. Dante got in beside him. He didn't crowd him. He sat by the far window, giving Elias space he hadn't expected. And for a long time, neither of them spoke as the city lights slid past. The silence between them was thick with everything unspoken. Elias could feel the alpha's presence like a physical weight, the scent of cedar and smoke wrapping around him even from across the seat. His instincts warred with his reason. Part of him wanted to press closer, to breathe that scent in deep and let it calm the frantic beating of his heart. The other part wanted to throw himself out of the moving car. You must think we're terrible, Elias finally said. He didn't know why he said it. Perhaps because the silence was worse. I think, Dante said, watching the road, that you are the only person in that house tonight who behaved with any dignity at all. Elias turned to look at him. Dante wasn't looking back. His profile was sharp against the passing lights, and something in the set of his jaw wasn't cruel. It was weary. The eyes that had seemed so cold in the living room now looked tired, haunted even. There were lines around them that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "You're supposed to be a monster," Elias said before he could stop himself. The faintest ghost of something crossed Dante's mouth. Not quite a smile. "Yes, I know what I'm supposed to be." He turned his head then, and their eyes met. In the dim light of the car, Dante's gaze was unreadable, but something in it made Elias's breath catch. The alpha's scent grew stronger, cedar and smoke and something darker, something that made Elias's instincts stir in a way he desperately tried to suppress. "He's an alpha, a dangerous one. And you're—" Elias looked away first. Dante said nothing more, and neither did Elias. The car carried him away from the only life he had ever known, toward a house on the water where everything he thought he understood about the world would slowly, gently, be turned upside down. The house was enormous. It sat above the water at the end of a long private drive, a great gray stone house with tall windows that glowed gold in the dark. Elias had cleaned houses for a living in his early 20s, had scrubbed the floors of homes like this while their owners looked through him as if he were part of the furniture. He had never imagined he would be brought to one as anything but the help. And yet, a woman in her 60s met them at the door, silver-haired, kind-eyed, wearing a cardigan and slippers rather than a uniform. She looked at Elias with open curiosity, and then unexpectedly with warmth. "This is Margaret," Dante said. "She runs the house. She'll show you where you'll be staying." He paused, then added almost stiffly, "You will not be locked in. You are not a prisoner here. If you need anything, ask her." And then he was gone, disappearing down a long hallway without another word. Elias was left standing in a marble foyer with a woman he'd never met. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You've had quite a night, haven't you, love?" It was such a simple human thing to say that Elias's composure, the stone he had built so carefully, cracked right down the middle. He pressed his hand to his mouth. He would not cry. He would not. Margaret said nothing more. She simply took Elias's arm, the way a mother might, the way his own mother never had, and led him gently up the stairs. The room was beautiful. Not a servant's room. A real room, with a soft bed and its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the black water. There were fresh flowers on the dresser. There was a robe laid across the bed. There was a tray with tea and something warm to eat. Dante had this prepared, Margaret said quietly. "Before you arrived." Elias stared at the flowers. He knew I was coming. He knew someone was coming. Margaret smoothed the coverlet. "He didn't know it would be you. He didn't know your family would send." She stopped herself. "Well, that's not my business. Get some rest, love. Things always look different in the morning." When she left, Elias stood in the middle of the room and tried to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. His family had sold him. His mother had called him strong, as if that made it okay. His father had looked at the floor rather than at his face. His brother had cried, but the tears hadn't changed anything. And Dante Marchetti, the alpha everyone feared, had looked at him with something that wasn't cruelty. Elias sat down on the edge of the bed. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something clean and masculine. The scent made his chest ache. He had never been given flowers before. But things did not look different in the morning. They looked stranger. Elias awoke to sunlight and the smell of coffee, and for one merciful second forgot where he was. Then it all came back, his father's averted eyes, his mother's hand on his arm. "You're so strong. You can handle it." And the grief of it pressed down on his chest like a stone. He got up. He dressed in the clothes he'd worn the night before, because they were all he had. And he went downstairs, because he didn't know what else to do. and because if he was going to work off a debt, he supposed he had better find out what the work was. He found Dante in a large sunlit kitchen, alone, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. Dante looked up when he came in. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, a spark of recognition that Elias felt in his bones. The Alpha's scent hit him again, stronger now in the warmth of the kitchen, and Elias's instincts stirred restlessly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You didn't have to make up a room like that," Elias said finally. "The flowers. I'm here to work. You could have put me anywhere." Dante set down his cup. "Is that what you think this is? Isn't it?" Elias crossed his arms. "My family owes you money. I'm the payment. You said 2 years. So tell me what you want me to do. Clean, cook, whatever it is. And I'll do it. And I'll count the days until it's done. And then I'll never see any of you again." Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. "Sit down, Elias. Please." Elias hesitated, then sat. "I'm going to tell you something," Dante said, sitting across from him. "And I need you to listen carefully, because I will only say it once." He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I lend money. That's one of the things I do. When people can't pay, there are consequences. I won't pretend otherwise. And I won't insult you by pretending I'm a good man." He met Elias's eyes. "But I have never in my life taken a person as payment. That is not who I am. That is not what I do." Elias frowned. "But you said." "I said the debt needed a guarantee. Collateral. A signature on a business. A lien on a property. Something. It was your father who suggested a person. It was your family who decided that person should be you." Elias felt his stomach drop. "When I arrived last night," Dante continued, his voice low and steady, "I fully expected to renegotiate terms. Instead, I walked into a room where a family was trading away their eldest son to protect the younger one, and telling themselves it was because he was strong enough to bear it." His jaw tightened. "I have seen a great deal of ugliness in my life, Elias. That was among the ugliest." Elias sat very still. "Then why did you take me?" "Because," Dante said quietly, "if I had left you there in that house with those people, do you think they would have suddenly begun to treat you with kindness? Or do you think they would have found the next thing to take from you, and the next, until there was nothing left?" Elias had no answer, because he knew. He had always known. "You owe me nothing," Dante said. "There is no debt for you to work off. The arrangement I make with your family is between me and them. And I assure you, I will handle it." He leaned forward slightly. "You are free to leave this house today. This hour, if you wish. I'll have you driven anywhere you'd like to go." Elias stared at him. "Free." The word didn't seem to fit in his mouth. "And if I don't have anywhere to go?" For the first time, something in Dante's weary face softened. "Then you may stay here as long as you need. As a guest, not as payment. You'll want for nothing." He paused. "But I'll understand if you'd rather not stay under the roof of a man like me." And Elias, 26 years old, cast off by his own blood, with nowhere in the world that wanted him, looked at this dangerous stranger who had just offered him the first genuine kindness he could remember. And he didn't know whether to laugh or weep. "I have nowhere to go," he said at last. "So I suppose I'll stay. For now." Something eased in Dante's shoulders. "For now," he agreed. The days that followed were the strangest of Elias's life. He kept waiting for the catch. He had spent 26 years learning that kindness always came with a bill attached. His parents' affection had always been conditional, given when he complied, withdrawn when he questioned. Every act of generosity from his family had been a transaction, a loan with invisible interest. So he braced himself for the moment Dante would reveal what he truly wanted from him. But the moment never came. Instead, There was breakfast every morning in the sunlit kitchen, with Dante already there, reading his newspaper, looking up when Elias walked in with an expression that was almost warm. The first morning, Elias had tried to make himself invisible, to take his food to his room. Dante had stopped him with a quiet, "Stay, please." So he stayed, and they ate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't demand anything from him. There were long, quiet dinners where little by little, the two of them began to talk. Dante asked about his life, his work, his dreams. He listened in a way no one ever had. Not his parents, not his brother, not any of the people who had passed through his life. When Elias spoke, Dante's eyes stayed on his face, and he asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually paying attention. "Tell me about the writing," Dante said one evening. Elias froze. "How did you know I write? I saw the notebooks in your room." Dante's voice was careful, gentle. "I wasn't snooping. Margaret mentioned them when she was cleaning. She said you had pages and pages tucked away." Elias felt heat rise to his cheeks. "It's nothing. Just private things. Nothing important." "Everything you do is important," Dante said simply. And Elias didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever told him that before. There was Margaret, who fussed over him and told him stories and treated him like he mattered. She brought him tea when he looked tired, and blankets when the evening grew cool, and she never asked for anything in return. There was the freedom to walk the grounds, to read in the enormous library, to simply rest in a way he had not rested in decades. Dante had a library that stretched 2 floors, filled with books on every subject imaginable. Elias spent hours there, losing himself in stories that had nothing to do with his own. He kept trying to make himself useful. He couldn't help it. He reorganized the pantry. He fixed a squeaky door no one had gotten around to. He started leaving little notes for Margaret and cooking on the days the housekeeper was tired. Dante noticed. He noticed everything. "You don't have to do these things," he told Elias one evening, finding him polishing silver at the kitchen table simply because his hands needed something to do. "I know," Elias said. "I want to. It's the only way I know how to feel like I'm not just taking." Dante sat down across from him. He did that more and more now, finding excuses to be near Elias, to sit across from him or beside him, to let their shoulders brush when they walked through the garden. "You spent your whole life being useful to people who never once thanked you for it," he said. "Didn't you?" Elias's hands went still on the silver. "How did you know that?" "Because I watched a family sell you like livestock and call it a compliment." Dante's voice was gentle. "People like your family. They find the ones who give, and they take and take. And they teach them that giving is the only reason they're loved at all." He held Elias's eyes. "It isn't true. What they taught you isn't true." It was the first time Elias had felt the full weight of those gray eyes on him. He felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that spread through him like sunlight through a window. "This is dangerous," he thought. "He's an alpha. But he couldn't look away. "Thank you," he whispered. Dante reached across the table and covered Elias's hand with his own. The touch was electric. Elias felt it all the way down to his bones, a shiver that had nothing to do with cold. His scent must have shifted, because Dante's nostrils flared slightly, and something dark flickered in his eyes. But he didn't move closer. He didn't take what Elias's body was offering. He simply squeezed his hand once and let go. "Thank you for staying," Dante said. He learned things about Dante too, in those slow warm weeks. He learned that Dante had inherited his father's empire and hated most of it. That he gave enormous sums quietly to a children's hospital across town and would deny it if asked. That he had lost his husband 9 years ago to a long illness and had not let anyone close since. That the coldness people feared in him was not cruelty at all. It was grief. worn like armor for so long he'd forgotten how to take it off. People think a hard man has no heart, Margaret told him one afternoon, watching Dante through the window as he walked the grounds alone. But sometimes a man goes hard on the outside precisely because the inside got broken so badly. Dante grieved himself half to death and decided never to feel it again. She looked at Elias sideways. Funny thing is, since you came, I've seen him smile more than I have in 9 years. Elias pretended not to hear that, but he felt it warm in his cheeks the rest of the day. He began watching Dante more closely after that. Noticed the way he stood at the window some nights, staring out at the water with an expression of such profound loneliness that it made Elias's chest ache. Noticed the way he pulled back whenever someone got too close, as if expecting to be hurt again. Noticed the way he looked at Elias when he thought Elias wasn't watching, like he was something precious, something fragile, something to be protected. And he began quietly to do the one thing he had done all his life to survive. He began to write. He had always written little stories, tucked away in notebooks hidden from a family who would have laughed at them. Stories about men who were finally seen, men who were finally chosen, men who walked out of the shadows and into the light. He had never shown them to anyone. He had been too afraid. But now, in the quiet of that beautiful house, with the water shining outside his window, the stories came pouring out of him like water through a broken dam. He wrote late into the night. He wrote about a man who had been thrown away and found, against all odds, that he was worth more than the people who discarded him had ever known. He wrote about an alpha who had closed his heart to the world and an omega who walked into it anyway. He wrote about grief and healing, about learning to trust again, about the way love could find you when you least expected it. He did not tell Dante. He did not tell anyone. He simply wrote and healed. And slowly, so slowly he barely noticed it happening, he began to become someone new. One evening, about 6 weeks into his stay, Elias was sitting in the library when he felt Dante's presence before he heard him. The alpha's scent preceded him, wrapping around Elias like a warm blanket. "May I sit with you?" Dante asked from the doorway. Elias nodded, unable to speak. His heart was suddenly pounding for no reason he could name. Dante crossed the room and sat in the chair across from Elias. But close enough that Elias could feel the warmth radiating off his body, could catch the subtle shift in his scent that meant he was nervous. Why would he be nervous? "I wanted to talk to you about something," Dante said. Elias closed his book. "What about?" Dante was quiet for a long moment. His fingers drummed against his knee, a nervous gesture Elias had never seen from him before. "When I lost my husband," Dante finally said, "I thought I would never feel anything again. I thought the part of me that could love had died with him. I built walls around myself so high that no one could get in." He looked up, and his gray eyes met Elias's. "And then you walked into my life. Not as a transaction, not as a payment, as a person, as someone who had been hurt just as badly as I had, and who was still standing. Daniel, let me finish." Dante leaned forward. "I need you to understand that what I feel for you is not pity. It's not obligation. It's not some misplaced savior complex. I know myself well enough to know the difference." His voice dropped. "I care about you, Elias, more than I have cared about anyone in 9 years. And it terrifies me, because I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I can be what you need. But I also don't know if I can go on pretending I don't feel this." Elias's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Dante said, "that I think I'm falling in love with you. And I'm saying it badly, because I haven't done this in a very long time." The room was very quiet. Elias could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "You don't have to say anything," Dante continued quickly. "I don't expect. I know this is." "Daniel." Dante stopped. Elias set down his book. He moved out of his chair and knelt in front of Dante's, so that they were eye to eye. He reached out and took the alpha's hands in his. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," he said softly. "And it terrifies me just as much. Because I've never been loved before. Not really. Not the way you're showing me. And I don't know how to trust it. But I want to try." Dante's eyes widened. "Elias, I want to try," Elias repeated. "Because you're the first person who ever saw me. The first person who ever made me feel like I mattered. And I don't want to lose that." Dante pulled him into his arms. The embrace was fierce and careful all at once, as if Elias were something precious that might break. His scent surrounded Elias, cedar and smoke, and something warmer now, something that smelled like home. "Thank you," Dante whispered into his hair. "Thank you for giving me a chance." But the trouble, when it came from where trouble always came from. His family. It was Leo who called first, about 2 months in. His voice sugary and careful. "Eli? Oh my God, we've been so worried about you. How are you? Is it awful?" Elias stood in the hall with the phone pressed to his ear. "It's not awful," he said. "Oh, thank goodness, Eli. I feel just terrible about everything. I really do. But I was thinking, you're staying at his house, right? So you must have access to. I mean, he's rich, Eli. And after everything I've been through, I just thought maybe you could." Elias hung up the phone. It rang again immediately. He did not answer. That night at dinner, Dante noticed his silence. "What's happened?" Elias told him. He hadn't meant to, but it came out. Leo's call, the sugar and the ask, the way even now, even after all of it, his family saw him as nothing but a resource to be mined. Dante's expression darkened. But when he spoke, his voice was calm. "May I tell you something you may not want to hear?" "Go ahead. Your family has not stopped calling me either." He set down his fork. "Your father has phoned my office 4 times. Not to ask how you are. To ask whether the debt can be restructured. Whether Leo's remaining balance might be forgiven. Given his words, inconvenience the family has already suffered on my behalf." Elias felt sick. The inconvenience being me. The inconvenience being you. Dante watched him carefully. "I wanted you to know. Because they will use you. They will always use you, Elias. For as long as you let them believe they can. And there's only one way to stop it." Dante nodded. "To stop needing their love. To find out that you are worth something entirely on your own. And then to stand in a room with them and let them see it. That's the only thing people like that understand. Not tears. Not pleading. Standing." Elias thought about that for a long time after he went to bed. He thought about it as he opened his laptop and began once again to write. 2 months into his stay, Elias did something he had never dared to do. He submitted one of his stories. There was a well-known publisher of LGBTQ fiction that ran an open competition each year, a prize for undiscovered writers with a substantial cash award and a publishing contract for the winner. He had seen it advertised for years and never had the courage. But now, sitting in a house where for the first time someone had told him he was worth something, he took the manuscript he had poured his whole broken heart into, gave himself a pen name, Evan Steele, and sent it off before he could talk himself out of it. He told no one. Not Margaret. Not Dante. It felt too fragile. Too precious. Like a candle flame he had to cup in both hands. And then he waited. Meanwhile, something was changing between him and Dante. And both of them knew it. And neither of them spoke of it. It was in the way Dante began to linger at breakfast, finding excuses to stay at the table longer, asking Elias about his day, his thoughts, his dreams. He would sit beside Elias instead of across from him now, close enough that their shoulders brushed, close enough that Elias could feel the warmth of his body. It was in the way Elias found himself listening for Dante's footsteps in the evening, his heart lifting when he heard them approach. He would pretend to read, pretending not to notice when Dante came to stand in the doorway, just watching him with that soft expression. It was in the long walks they took along the water, where Dante told him about his husband, about his grief, about the boy he had once been before the world made him hard. He talked about the mistakes he'd made, the things he regretted, the ways he'd tried and failed to be a better man. I was so angry after he died, Dante admitted one afternoon. At the world. At God. At myself. I pushed everyone away because it was easier than letting them see how broken I was. Did it help? Elias asked. Dante shook his head. It made it worse, but I didn't know how to stop. Until you. Elias looked at him. What did I do? You didn't do anything. Dante's voice was rough. You just existed. You walked into my house, and you were kind, even after everything that had been done to you. You were broken too, but you didn't use it as an excuse to hurt people. You just kept going. And I realized I wanted to be more like you. Elias didn't know what to say to that. So he reached out and took Dante's hand. And they walked the rest of the way in silence, their fingers intertwined. It was in the way one rainy afternoon, when Elias finally cried. Really cried for everything his family had done, for the years he had wasted trying to earn a love that was never coming. Dante didn't tell him to be strong. He simply sat with him and held his hand and let him weep until he was empty. You don't have to be strong with me, Dante said quietly. You can just be Elias. No one had ever said that to him before. In his whole life. No one had ever once said that to him. Elias looked up through his tears, and for the first time, he let himself really look at Dante. At the alpha who had shown him more tenderness in 2 months than his family had shown him in 26 years. At the man whose grief had turned to stone around him, and who was slowly, carefully, learning to soften again. I love him, Elias thought, and it frightened him. Because he didn't know if a man like Dante could love him back. A discarded omega. A family's cast-off. Worth nothing to the people who should have loved him most. But he was wrong about that. He was wrong about a great many things. The letter came on an ordinary Tuesday. Elias opened it at the kitchen table, with Margaret humming nearby, and he read it twice. And then a third time. And then his hands began to shake. Dear Mr. Steele, it began. It is our great pleasure to inform you that your submission has been selected as the winner of this year's competition. He had won. He had won a cash prize, enough to live on for 2 years. A publishing contract. A launch. And the letter said, an invitation to be honored at the publisher's annual gala, where the winner would be announced publicly to the industry and the press. Elias sat frozen, the letter trembling in his hands. Margaret took one look at his face and dropped her dish towel. Love? What's happened? And Elias began to laugh. And then to cry. And then to laugh again. Because for the first time in his entire life, he had done something for himself. In secret. Out of his own pain and his own heart. And the world had told him it was good. I did something, he whispered. Margaret, I did something. That night, he told Dante. He didn't know what he'd expected. For Dante to be surprised. For him to be kind. For him to say talented boy, the way people said such things, patting him on the head and moving on. Instead, when Elias finished, Dante set down his glass and looked at him with an expression he had never seen on the alpha's face before. Show me, Dante said. What? You're writing. Show me. I want to read it. And then, more quietly, I want to know you, Elias. All of you. The part you've kept hidden from everyone. Elias brought him the manuscript. And that night, instead of coming to dinner, Dante read it. Every page. In his study. Alone. And when he finally emerged near midnight, he came to find Elias in the library, where Elias sat pretending to read, his heart in his throat. Dante stood in the doorway for a long moment. There were unshed tears in his gray eyes. "This is you," he said. "Isn't it? All of it. The man who's thrown away. The one who finds out he's worth more than they knew." Elias nodded, unable to speak. Dante crossed the room. He knelt down in front of Elias's chair so that they were eye to eye. "Elias," he said, and his voice was rough. "In 9 years, I have not let a single person pass these walls. I told myself I never would again. And then your family sold you to me like something they'd finished with. And I brought you into this house thinking I was doing a decent thing for once in my life." He took Elias's hands. "But the truth is, you're the one who saved me. You walked into my grief, and you filled it with light. And you didn't even know you were doing it. Dante, I love you," Dante said simply. "Not the useful you. Not the strong you. The man who writes stories in the dark because no one ever told him he was allowed to shine. I love that man, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure he is never thrown away by anyone ever again." Elias looked at this man, this dangerous, grieving, gentle alpha who had shown him more tenderness in 2 months than his family had shown him in 26 years. And he began to cry. And this time, they were not tears of grief. "I love you too," he whispered. "I think I've loved you since the night you told me I was the only one in that room with any dignity." Dante kissed him then, gently, reverently, the way a man kisses something he has decided to cherish for the rest of his days. And for the first time in his life, Elias did not feel like he was being taken from. He felt like he was being chosen. Word travels fast, even through the darkest channels. And when Elias's family learned 2 things at nearly the same time. First, that a man named Evan Steele had won a major literary prize and was in fact their own Elias. And second, that Elias had become something to Dante far more precious than any collateral. They descended on the situation like crows on a fresh-turned field. The phone calls became relentless. Suddenly, his mother was weeping down the line about how much they missed him. Suddenly, Leo was calling him "my darling brother" and asking, oh so casually, whether he might introduce his gallery to some of Dante's wealthy friends. Suddenly, his father, who had not been able to look at him the night he sold him, was leaving voicemails about families sticking together and how proud he was. Elias did not answer any of them. But there was one problem he could not simply ignore, and its name was Valentina Rossi. Valentina was the daughter of an old and powerful family, the kind Dante's late husband had always hoped he would ally with politically. For years, Valentina and her father had circled Dante, pressing for a match that would join 2 empires. Dante had refused, again and again, sensing weakness. Sensing that Dante's cold heart had finally cracked open for someone, Valentina arrived at the house one afternoon, uninvited, sleek and polished, and armed with a smile like a blade. Elias was in the sitting room when she was shown in. The alpha woman looked him up and down with practiced disdain. "So," she said, settling into a chair as if she owned it, "you're the little charity case. The one the family sold off." She smiled. "I heard the whole story. How tragic. Do you know Dante and I have an understanding? We have for years. His husband wanted it. My father wants it. It's really only a matter of time." She tilted her head. "Whatever this is, this arrangement, this little fantasy you've built in your head, it isn't real. Alphas like Dante don't marry the help. They keep them for a while, and then they marry someone like me." Elias felt the old familiar fear rise up in him. The voice that had lived in him all his life, whispering you're nothing, you're nothing, you're nothing. Of course he'll leave you for someone better. But then he thought of Dante kneeling in front of his chair. He thought of the manuscript Dante had read cover to cover. He thought of Margaret saying, "Since you came, I've seen him smile more than I have in 9 years. And the fear, for once, did not win. You may be right about a great many things, Elias said quietly. You come from a better family. You have better manners. You certainly have a better dress. He stood. But you're wrong about one thing. You think being chosen is about being the most polished person in the room. It isn't. It's about being seen. And you've never in your life let anyone see who you really are, because I suspect you're afraid of what they'd find. He walked to the door and held it open. Dante sees me. All of me. That's something you can't buy. And it's something you can't take. I'll ask Margaret to see you out. Valentina's polished face twisted with fury. She rose, opened her mouth to say something venomous. And then Dante's voice cut across the room from the hallway, cold as winter water. He stood in the doorway, and there was nothing warm in his gray eyes now. I don't recall inviting you into my home. Dante, darling, you came to frighten a man I love in my own house. He stepped aside, making room for her to pass. Let me be as clear as I have ever been with anyone. There is no understanding between us. There never was. Whatever my husband wanted died with him. And if you or your family ever speak to Elias again in any tone but the most respectful, you will find out precisely why people are afraid of me. He took a step forward. Now get out. Valentina went white. She gathered what remained of her dignity and swept out without another word. When the door closed, Dante crossed the room to Elias and took his face in his hands. I heard what you said to her, he murmured. About being seen. His thumb brushed Elias's cheek. You didn't need me to defend you at all, did you? You defended yourself. Elias smiled. A real smile. The smile of a man who was, at last, learning his own worth. No, he said. But it was nice to look up and find you there anyway. The gala was held in a grand hotel ballroom, all crystal and candlelight, filled with writers and editors, and the sort of people who decided which stories the world got to hear. Elias stood at the edge of it in a suit of deep midnight blue, chosen by his own hand, bought with his own prize money. And for a moment, he could hardly believe he was there at all. Dante stood beside him, tall and handsome in black, his hand resting warm at the small of Elias's back. You're trembling, Dante said softly. I keep waiting to wake up, Elias whispered. You're not going to wake up. Dante looked at him with such tenderness that it made Elias's breath catch. This is your life now, Elias. You earned every bit of it. Go up there when they call your name and let the whole world see you. But Elias was not the only person who had received an invitation to that gala. Because word had spread of the prize, of the money, of the mysterious Evan Steele who had turned out to be one of their own. His family had come. His father in his one good suit. His mother in pearls Elias had never seen. And Leo, radiant and beaming, already telling anyone who would listen that yes, the celebrated Evan Steele was his brother. His dear, talented brother. They'd always known he had a gift. They found him near the stage. His mother reached for him with both hands. Elias. Oh, sweetheart, we're so proud. Look at you. We always knew you were special. Did you? Elias said. His mother faltered. Of course we did, darling. You knew I was special? Elias's voice was quiet, but it carried. Around them, people began, subtly, to listen. The night you gave me away, you told me I was strong enough to bear it. That's what you called it. Strong. You told me Leo was too fragile, so I had to be the one. And now that I've won a prize, and there's money, and there's a powerful man on my arm, suddenly you've always known I was special? His father shifted uncomfortably. Elias, this isn't the place. No, Elias agreed. It isn't. This is a room full of strangers who read my story. The story of a man whose own family threw him away and cared more about him than the people who share his blood ever did. He looked at each of them in turn. His father, who would not meet his eyes. His mother, whose smile was crumbling. his brother, who had gone very pale. You didn't sell me to save Leo. You sold me because you thought I was the one who'd let you. Because I always let you. Because for 26 years I believed the only way you'd love me was if I gave you everything and asked for nothing back. Eli, Leo whispered. Please. I'm not finished. Elias's voice did not shake. I want to thank you. Truly. Because when you handed me to the most feared alpha in this city, you thought you were throwing me into the dark. He reached over and took Dante's hand. Instead, you handed me to the first person who ever looked at me and saw someone worth cherishing. You meant it as a punishment. It turned out to be the greatest gift anyone ever gave me. Entirely by accident. A hush had fallen over that corner of the ballroom. I forgive you, Elias said quietly. Not because you deserve it. Because carrying it makes me heavy. And I'm done being weighed down by people who only love what I can give them. I forgive you. And I'm letting you go. He lifted his chin. You'll hear the debt is settled. Dante is forgiving it. Not for your sake. For mine. So that nothing ties me to you ever again. Your gallery is your own to save or sink. And after tonight, I'd ask that you not contact me again unless you have learned how to love a person for something other than his usefulness. If that day ever comes, my door will be open. Until then, it's closed. And then, at the front of the room, a voice rang out over the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the winner of this year's prize. The man whose extraordinary story has moved readers across the country. Evan Steele. The room burst into applause. Elias let go of his mother's outstretched hand. He squeezed Dante's fingers once. And then he walked past his stunned family, through the parting crowd, up the steps, and into the light. To accept at last, in front of the whole world, the recognition he had spent his entire life being denied. He stood at the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. And he saw Dante at the back, watching him with tears in his eyes and pride written all over him. I wrote this story, Elias began, his voice clear and steady, because I once believed I was only worth what I could give to other people. I want to say something tonight to every man listening who has ever felt the same. He paused. Your worth was never theirs to decide. Not your family's. Not anyone's. You are not the leftover. You are not the strong one who can bear anything so the others don't have to. You are a whole person, deserving of a love that cherishes you exactly as you are. His voice trembled just once, and then held. I found that love in the most unlikely place, at the most broken moment of my life. And if I can find it, the man they threw away, then so can you. Never let anyone convince you that you are less than a king. Because you are. You always were. You just needed one person finally to see it. The applause was thunderous. Men in the audience were weeping. And in the very back of that grand ballroom, Dante mouthed 3 words that Elias read as clearly as if he'd shouted them across the room. I see you. They were mated the following spring. The ceremony was held in the garden of the great gray house above the water, with the sea shining beyond. Only the people who truly loved Elias were in attendance. Margaret, who cried through the entire ceremony and served as something like a mother of the groom, a handful of new friends from the publishing world, and a few of Dante's quiet, watchful men who had, over the months, come to regard Elias with genuine devotion. His family was not there. He had not invited them. And he found, standing in his suit among the roses with Dante's hands in his, that it did not hurt the way he had feared it would. He had grieved the family he wished he'd had. Now he had built a better one. Margaret walked him down the aisle. In 50 years of service, the old woman whispered, patting his arm, I've never been prouder to walk anyone anywhere. Go on, love. He's been waiting for you a lot longer than he knows. And Dante, the alpha the whole city had once feared, The man who had not smiled in 9 years stood at the end of that garden path and watched Elias come toward him with an expression of such open, undisguised joy that several of the guests began to cry just from the sight of it. When the officiant asked if he would love and cherish him all the days of his life, Dante didn't simply say, "I do." He took Elias's hands and said, "I do. And I will spend every one of those days making certain he knows he is treasured." He was handed to me as if he were worth nothing. He turned out to be worth everything. I intend to prove that to him for the rest of my life. There was not a dry eye in the garden that autumn. Elias's first novel was published under the name Evan Steele. It became a sensation, the story of a discarded Omega who discovers his own immeasurable worth, read and loved by men all over the country who saw their own hidden hearts in its pages. He kept the pen name, not to hide behind any longer, but to honor the frightened young man he had once been. The one who wrote in the dark because no one had ever told him he was allowed to shine. He started a foundation too, quietly at first, and then not so quietly. A fund for Omegas rebuilding their lives after being cast off, cast out, or cast down. Dante matched every dollar he raised and asked for no credit. "You saved me," Elias told him when he thanked him. "Let me help you save a few others." As for his family, they did make contact once more. Some years later, there had been hard times. There had been reflection, or so they claimed. Elias read the long letter carefully, more than once. He didn't know whether it was true repentance or simply need dressed up as regret. But he had grown by then into a man who could hold the door open without being afraid of who might walk through it, and who could just as easily keep it shut. He wrote back kindly but clearly. That time and small honest steps would tell. He was no longer available to be used, but he was perhaps someday available to be known. The choice was theirs. It always had been. And on a golden evening in their 6th year of mating, Elias sat on the terrace of the great gray house with Dante beside him. The sea turned to fire beneath the setting sun. Dante's arm was around his shoulders. Elias's latest manuscript sat finished on his lap. Margaret was singing somewhere inside, off-key and happy. "Do you ever think," Elias said softly, "about that first night? When you drove me away from that house and neither of us said a word?" "Every day," Dante said. "I think about a man who had just been betrayed by everyone he loved, and who still had more dignity in him than anyone I'd ever met." He pressed a kiss to Elias's hair. "I think about how close I came to letting them frighten me out of loving you. And I thank God I didn't." Elias leaned into him, watching the sun sink into the sea. And he felt something he had spent his entire life reaching for and never once held. Peace. Belonging. The certainty, bone deep and permanent, that he was cherished. Not for what he could give. Not for what he could bear. But simply, entirely, for who he was. They had sold him to save someone else. And in doing so, without ever meaning to, they had finally set him free.